Before we begin, we publish new content every day. So be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. The phone call that shattered my world came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October. I know the exact time because I was staring at the digital clock on my nightstand, wondering if I should take another sleeping pill when Leo's name flashed across my phone screen. I am Leo Santos, 73 years old, and I have spent most of my life being the one everyone calls when things go wrong. When my sister died in that car accident 15 years ago, I became Leo's guardian, his anchor in a world that had suddenly become very cruel to a 13-year-old boy. Leo was my everything after that. The son I never had. The light that kept me going through my own grief, and the slow, inevitable decline that comes with age. The voice on the other end of that call was barely recognizable as my Leo. It was fragmented, desperate, punctuated by what sounded like struggling and the crash of something heavy hitting the floor. All I could make out clearly were his final words before the line went dead. Isabella. The painting. Don't trust. The silence that followed was deafening. More terrifying than any scream could have been. I called back immediately. The phone rang and rang until it went to voicemail. That cheerful message Leo had recorded just months earlier when he moved in with those artist friends of his. Isabella Martinez and Alex Chen, he had told me, were established sculptors who had offered him a place to stay while he worked on his portfolio for art school applications. At the time, I had felt relieved that my 28-year-old grandson finally had peers who understood his artistic vision, people who could guide him in ways that I, with my background in elementary school teaching, simply could not. The next morning brought no word from Leo. I called his phone obsessively, each unanswered ring tightening the knot of fear in my chest. By noon, I could no longer stand the waiting. I drove across the city to the converted warehouse where Leo had been living, my arthritic hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. When Isabella answered the door, I was struck by how composed she appeared. She was a striking woman in her early 30s, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and she wore a flowing black dress that made her look like she had just stepped out of an art gallery opening, rather than been woken by an unexpected visitor. She invited me in with a gracious smile that somehow made me feel like I was intruding. The space was immaculate, all white walls and carefully arranged furniture that looked more like museum pieces than things people actually lived with. Alex appeared from what I assumed was the kitchen, a mountain of a man with close-cropped hair and eyes that never quite met mine. He nodded in acknowledgement but said nothing, positioning himself slightly behind Isabella like a bodyguard. When I asked about Leo, Isabella's expression shifted to one of practiced sympathy. She explained that Leo had been struggling with some personal issues lately, becoming increasingly paranoid and unstable. There had been an argument the night before, she said. Something about his art not being good enough. About feeling like he was being used. He had stormed out around midnight, and they had not seen him since. She suggested that perhaps he had gone to stay with other friends, that he needed space to work through whatever was troubling him. Everything about her explanation felt wrong. Leo had always been sensitive about his art, yes, but paranoid and unstable were not words that had ever applied to my grandson. He was gentle, thoughtful, perhaps naive in the way that young artists often are, but never unstable. And he would never, ever disappear without calling me. We had been through too much together for him to simply vanish. Later that day, I went to the police station to file a missing person report. The detective who took my statement, a tired-looking man named Harding, who seemed to be counting down the days until his retirement, listened politely but with obvious skepticism. Young adults, he explained, often needed space from family. Leo was 28, legally an adult, and there was no evidence of foul play. Unless he had been missing for 48 hours, or there were signs of violence, there was little they could do beyond taking a report. I left the police station feeling more alone than I had since my sister's death. The drive home passed in a blur of traffic lights and half-formed plans. all of them seeming inadequate against the growing certainty that something terrible had happened to Leo. The next morning, desperation drove me to do something I never thought I would do. Leo had always been careful about his privacy, but he had also been trusting enough to share his passwords with me in case of emergencies. Using his laptop, which he had left at my house during his last visit, I logged into his cloud storage account. Most of what I found was expected. Photographs from art school, sketches, essays about various artists and movements. But there was one folder that made my blood run cold. It was encrypted and titled "The Final Painting," and it took me 3 tries to guess that the password was our old dog's name combined with my birthday. Inside were journal entries that Leo had been keeping for the past 6 months. Documents that revealed a very different picture of his living situation than the one he had painted for me during our weekly phone calls. The early entries were optimistic, full of excitement about living with established artists who appreciated his work. But as the months progressed, the tone grew darker. Isabella, according to Leo's writings, had begun to exert more and more control over his daily life. She critiqued everything he created, often reducing him to tears with her cutting comments about his technique or his vision. She had convinced him to quit his part-time job at the coffee shop, arguing that it was taking time away from his art, leaving him completely financially dependent on her and Alex. More disturbing were the references to something Isabella called the perfect trifecta, a philosophy she had developed about the ideal artistic collaboration. According to her theory, true art could only be created when a man, a woman, and a pure artistic soul came together in perfect harmony. Leo, she had told him, was meant to be that artistic soul, the vessel through which she and Alex would channel their greatest work. The final entry, dated just 2 days before Leo's frantic phone call, was the most chilling of all. In it, Leo wrote about overhearing Isabella and Alex discussing something they called the transformation process. How the artistic soul had to be willing to sacrifice everything, including life itself, for the sake of true art. He wrote that he was beginning to fear for his safety, that he felt trapped and didn't know how to escape without endangering himself further. The next morning, armed with printed copies of Leo's journal entries, I returned to the warehouse. This time, Isabella's composure cracked slightly when I confronted her with Leo's own words. She laughed, but there was something sharp and brittle in the sound. She dismissed Leo's fears as the ramblings of an unstable mind, someone who had always been too sensitive for his own good. She turned the conversation back on me, suggesting that perhaps if I had been a better guardian, had provided Leo with more stability and less codependency, he wouldn't have developed such an unhealthy attachment to conspiracy theories about the people trying to help him. Her words cut deep because they played on my own insecurities about raising Leo. Had I been too protective? Too involved in his life? Had my love somehow damaged him, made him weak and susceptible to whatever psychological break Isabella was describing? Alex stepped forward as Isabella spoke, not saying anything but using his considerable physical presence to make me feel small and unwelcome in their space. I found myself backing toward the door, clutching Leo's journal entries like a lifeline, feeling defeated and foolish. Meanwhile, the harassment began almost immediately after I left their warehouse that second time. I returned home to find that someone had slashed all 4 tires on my car. The next morning, I discovered a dead crow on my front porch, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle. My phone began receiving calls at all hours of the night, no one speaking when I answered, just breathing, and then the line going dead. I knew Isabella and Alex were responsible, but proving it was another matter entirely. When I called the police about the harassment, I was told that there was no evidence linking the incidents to anyone specific. Detective Harding, when I managed to reach him directly, suggested that perhaps the stress of Leo's disappearance was making me paranoid, but something in his voice had changed since our first meeting. Maybe it was the persistence of my calls, or maybe it was the detailed evidence I had compiled about Leo's state of mind before his disappearance, but Harding seemed to be taking my concerns more seriously. When I showed him the journal entries, he studied them with the attention of someone who had seen enough missing person cases to recognize when family intuition might be more reliable than standard protocol. Later that day, Harding called to tell me that he had managed to obtain a warrant to search Isabella and Alex's warehouse. The search, conducted the following morning, revealed very little at first glance. The space had been cleaned thoroughly, almost obsessively so. Isabella's art studio, in particular, was pristine in a way that struck the investigating officers as unusual for a working artist's space. However, when the crime scene technicians tested the bathroom with luminol, a chemical that reveals traces of blood even after extensive cleaning, the results were dramatic. The entire floor of the bathroom glowed blue under the UV light, as did the bathtub and the area around the drain. Someone had spilled a significant amount of blood in that room and then worked very hard to clean it up. The next morning brought news that made my heart race with both hope and terror. Isabella and Alex had disappeared overnight, abandoning the warehouse and leaving no forwarding address. Detective Harding put out a bolo alert for both of them, but they seemed to have vanished as completely as Leo had. Fortunately, my 40 years as an elementary school teacher had taught me more about organization and attention to detail than Isabella had perhaps anticipated. Using skills I had developed tracking down parents who forgot about parent-teacher conferences and monitoring students who tried to skip class, I began following the digital trail that Isabella and Alex had left behind. Credit card records, which Harding was able to access through proper legal channels, revealed a disturbing pattern of purchases in the days before Leo's disappearance. Isabella had bought large quantities of lye, a substance commonly used in soap making, but also notorious for its ability to dissolve organic matter. There were also purchases from a medical supply company, bone saws and other tools that had no obvious artistic application. Most significantly, the records showed that Isabella had rented a storage unit at a facility on the outskirts of the city, paying for 6 months in advance just 3 days before Leo's frantic phone call. Detective Harding and I arrived at the storage facility on a gray Thursday morning in November. The manager, a nervous man who kept glancing at Harding's badge as if it might bite him, led us to Unit 247. When he cut the lock and rolled up the metal door, the smell hit us immediately. A chemical odor so strong it made my eyes water. Inside, we found Leo's car, a battered Honda Civic that I had helped him buy when he graduated from high school. The trunk was empty but reeked of the same chemical smell that permeated the entire unit. More disturbing was what we found in the back seat: Leo's art supplies, his sketchbooks, and a small collection of sculptures that made my blood run cold. The sculptures were unlike anything I had ever seen Leo create. His work had always been characterized by warmth and humanity, figures that seemed to pulse with life even when carved from cold stone. These pieces were different. Twisted, grotesque figures that seemed to be writhing in agony. The material they were made from was unlike any clay or stone I recognized. And when Detective Harding examined them more closely, his expression grew grim. The storage unit also contained Isabella's art supplies and several finished pieces that were clearly meant for display. These were more polished than the rough sculptures we had found with Leo's things, but they shared the same disturbing quality and were made from the same unidentifiable material. Detective Harding bagged everything as evidence and arranged for the sculptures to be sent to the state crime lab for analysis. The waiting period that followed was the longest week of my life. I found myself unable to eat, unable to sleep, caught between hope that we would find Leo alive somewhere and the growing certainty that we were dealing with something far worse than a simple missing person case. The call from the crime lab came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after Leo's disappearance. Detective Harding's voice was gentle when he delivered the news, but no amount of kindness could soften the horror of what they had discovered. The sculptures were made from a mixture of clay and human bone ash. DNA testing confirmed that the bone ash had come from Leo, my grandson, my beautiful, gentle boy who had dreamed of creating art that would make the world a better place, had been murdered and then transformed into the very art he had been trying to escape. Further investigation revealed the full extent of Isabella's depravity. The finished sculptures in the storage unit weren't the work of a deranged individual acting on impulse. They were part of a larger collection that Isabella had been preparing for a solo exhibition called Metamorphosis, scheduled to open at a downtown gallery in just 2 weeks. Detective Harding informed me that Isabella and Alex had been found, arrested at a hotel near the Canadian border. They had been planning to flee the country after the exhibition, taking the money from the sale of their grotesque art and starting fresh somewhere with no extradition treaty. But I didn't want Isabella to simply disappear into the legal system. Processed quietly and sentenced without the world knowing what she had done, Leo deserved better than that. His memory deserved better than that. Working with Detective Harding, I developed a plan that would ensure Isabella's crimes were exposed in the most public way possible. Instead of preventing the exhibition from opening, we would let it proceed as scheduled. Isabella, confident that she had covered her tracks, and that Leo's disappearance would be written off as another missing person case, had arranged to be released on bail specifically so she could attend her opening night. The gallery opening was exactly the kind of event Isabella thrived in. Well-dressed art collectors, sipping wine, while discussing the deeper meaning of contemporary sculpture. Isabella herself was the center of attention, radiant in a flowing red dress, discussing her vision of art as transformation, and the beauty that could emerge from sacrifice. I watched from the back of the room as she held court, describing her artistic process to potential buyers, who nodded appreciatively at her words about the intersection of life and death in creative expression. She was in her element, feeding on the attention and admiration of people who had no idea they were looking at evidence of murder. At exactly 9 o'clock, as Isabella was delivering a prepared speech about the inspiration behind her Metamorphosis series, I gave Detective Harding the signal we had arranged. The large screens positioned around the gallery, which had been displaying information about the various pieces, suddenly switched to a video presentation I had spent weeks preparing. The video began with photographs of Leo as a child, images of him laughing and playing, his whole life ahead of him. Then came pictures from his teenage years, showing his artistic development, his first sculptures and paintings that revealed a talent that was already extraordinary. The audience, confused by the sudden change in programming, grew quiet as they watched this unknown young man's life unfold before them. Next came excerpts from Leo's journal entries, read aloud by a voice actor while the text appeared on screen. The room grew completely silent as the full horror of Leo's final months became clear. His growing fear, his recognition that he was trapped, his desperate attempts to understand what Isabella meant by the transformation process. The video then showed footage of the police investigation, the luminol testing that revealed blood throughout Isabella's bathroom, the discovery of the storage unit, the bone saws and lye that had been used to destroy my grandson's body. Finally, the crime lab report appeared on every screen in the gallery, confirming that the sculptures everyone had been admiring were made from the cremated remains of Leo Santos, age 28, who had been murdered by the artist they were celebrating. The largest screen in the gallery displayed a photograph of Leo's smiling face next to the text. "This is not art. This is evidence of murder." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Several people in the audience screamed. Others began vomiting, and within seconds the orderly gallery opening had descended into chaos. Isabella stood frozen on the small platform where she had been speaking, her face cycling through expressions of shock, rage, and something that might have been fear. Alex, who had been standing near the back exit, tried to run but was immediately tackled by undercover officers who had been positioned throughout the room. Detective Harding stepped onto the platform, placed handcuffs on Isabella's wrists, and announced loudly enough for everyone to hear that she was under arrest for the murder of Leo Santos. The media coverage that followed was everything I had hoped it would be. Isabella's arrest made national news, and the story of her grotesque art made from murder victims sparked conversations about the ethics of art, the vulnerability of young artists, and the importance of recognizing manipulative relationships before they turn deadly. During the trial, Alex agreed to testify against Isabella in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed the full extent of Isabella's manipulation and control, not just over Leo but over Alex himself. Isabella, he explained, had convinced him that their relationship was something transcendent, that normal moral rules didn't apply to artists of their caliber. She had persuaded him that Leo's death was necessary for the creation of their masterpiece, that it was actually an honor for Leo to become part of something so significant. Isabella was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Alex received 25 years for his role in Leo's murder. During her sentencing, Isabella showed no remorse, maintaining that her work represented a revolutionary breakthrough in conceptual art that small minds simply couldn't appreciate. Later that year, I established the Leo Santos Memorial Scholarship Fund, which provides financial support for young artists from disadvantaged backgrounds. The fund has already helped dozens of students pursue their artistic dreams without having to depend on predatory mentors or exploitative living situations. The final piece of healing came when I organized a proper exhibition of Leo's real work, paintings and sculptures that celebrated life rather than destroying it. The opening night was attended by many of his former classmates and teachers, people who remembered Leo as he really was, rather than as Isabella had tried to remake him. Standing in that gallery, surrounded by Leo's authentic artistic vision, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that terrible phone call in October. Not happiness exactly, because nothing could bring Leo back or undo the horror of what had been done to him, but I felt a sense of completion, of justice served and truth revealed. I had spent my entire adult life protecting and nurturing young people, first as a teacher and then as Leo's guardian. I had failed to protect Leo from Isabella's manipulation, but I had succeeded in ensuring that his death was not in vain, that his story would serve as a warning to other young artists about the predators who hide behind artistic pretension and pseudo-intellectual philosophies. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I had always been someone who avoided conflict, who tried to see the best in people and give them the benefit of the doubt. Leo's death taught me that sometimes love requires us to be warriors, to fight for the people we care about even when the battle seems hopeless. I still live in the same house where Leo grew up, still sleep in the same bedroom where I received that final phone call from him. But I'm not the same person who answered that call. I'm stronger now, more aware of my own power to influence events and protect the people I love. I've learned that being kind doesn't mean being passive, that being a protector sometimes requires us to be fierce. Every day, I receive emails from young artists who have heard Leo's story and found the courage to leave toxic relationships or report predatory mentors. Each of these messages reminds me that Leo's death, horrible as it was, has become a source of protection for other young people who might otherwise have fallen victim to predators like Isabella. The grief will never completely go away. There will always be moments when I think about calling Leo to tell him something funny that happened, or when I see a piece of art that I know he would have loved. But alongside the grief is something else. Pride in the young man he was, satisfaction in the justice that was served, and hope that his story will continue to protect others long after I'm gone. That's what love really means, I think. Not just protecting someone while they're with you, but ensuring that their legacy continues to protect others, even after they're gone. In that sense, Leo is still with me, still changing the world through his art and his story. And that knowledge, more than anything else, has allowed me to find peace in the midst of an unspeakable loss.